They said the barn belonged to a monster. That's what the townsfolk whispered when they passed the edge of the prairie. "Don't go near the ridge," they told their children. "That's where the giant lives. He's not right in the head. He might crush you without meaning to." No one had ever seen him hurt anyone, but his size frightened people. His silence unsettled them, so they kept their distance, and he let them. But one night, a woman came stumbling through the rain, thin as a shadow, barefoot, soaked to the bone. A widow, with nowhere to go. She'd lost everything, her husband to fever, her land to the bank, her name to silence. She found the barn by accident, or maybe by fate. The door creaked open, hay scattered across the floor, and in the far corner, a cot made of burlap and timber. She collapsed there, too tired to fear, too cold to care. She thought the barn was empty. She was wrong. In the morning, she woke to the smell of coffee, a blanket tucked around her, and a man, enormous, quiet, kind, sitting near the fire. She had no idea that the place she'd crawled into to die was the place where her life would finally begin.
The rain came without warning. 1 hour, the sky was a pale stretch of spring. The next, blackened like soot. Thunder rolled over the hills as if something deep underground was waking up. Evelyn kept walking. She had no choice. Her feet were blistered from 3 days on dirt roads, the soles of her shoes long since surrendered to rocks and mud. The hem of her dress clung to her calves, soaked and heavy. She had no shawl, no coat, only a small satchel that carried nothing of value. A cracked tin cup, a rusted spoon, a letter from a husband already buried months ago, and a single biscuit she hadn't eaten, not because she meant to save it, but because she couldn't feel hunger anymore. The towns she passed had nothing for her. Not kindness, not work, not food. One woman had closed her door with a smile too polite to be sincere. Another had offered a prayer, but not a crust of bread. Evelyn wasn't angry. Grief leaves no room for that. It leaves hollowness, and in hers, only numbness remained. The storm broke above her just as the horizon opened into a wide, empty field. No fences, no lanterns, just wind and wild grass, and the shiver of lightning cutting through the sky. She might have dropped there, just sunk into the earth and let it swallow her, if not for the shape she spotted in the distance. A barn. Wooden, old, tilting slightly from years of wind and weather. It stood like a forgotten sentinel at the edge of a ridge, half buried in brush. Evelyn didn't wonder who it belonged to. She didn't ask if she had the right. She simply moved. The door groaned open under her push, and a gust of hay dust met her face. Inside, the dark was almost soothing. She stepped over a rusted rake, past a broken wagon wheel, and into the straw-lined emptiness. It smelled of earth, old wood and horses, though no animals were inside. In the far corner, she found it. A cot, rough, handmade, layered with a wool blanket that looked untouched. She collapsed without grace. The straw poked through her dress, but she didn't care. Rain hammered the roof. Wind howled through a crack in the siding. She pulled the blanket around her with trembling fingers, curled into herself, and waited to either sleep or stop breathing. The barn didn't argue. It held her the way earth holds fallen leaves, silently, without judgment. She didn't hear the footsteps, didn't see the door open again, slow and cautious, didn't sense the massive frame that stood in the entrance, pausing for a long moment. The figure remained still, watching. Then a boot shifted, a hand brushed the wall, and a deep breath, barely audible beneath the storm, stirred the silence. But she was already gone to sleep.
Not peacefully, but completely.
And when morning came, she did not wake to rain. She woke to warmth. A fire crackled in a metal basin nearby, its glow flickering over the wooden walls. Coffee brewed somewhere, strong and dark. A folded blanket covered her shoulders, a second one placed near her feet. Her satchel had been moved, gently, placed near the cot leg. She sat up slowly, heart thudding. And then she saw him. In the opposite corner, seated on a low stool, his head bowed under the wide brim of a weathered hat, sat a man. Enormous, broad-backed. His arms rested on his knees, his hands calloused and scarred. He didn't move, just watched the fire. And Evelyn, for the first time in weeks, felt something stir in her chest that wasn't pain. It was fear, but not the kind that made you run. The kind that made you stay very, very still until you knew whether you were safe. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm orange hue across the worn planks of the barn. Evelyn didn't move. Not yet. She studied the man in the corner, every inch of him coiled in quiet restraint. His shoulders were broad as a wagon axle, his legs planted firm like tree roots. He wore a thick canvas shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and old scars. A leather belt hung with a hammer and a small pouch. His boots were splattered with dried mud. He didn't speak, didn't even look at her directly. Just sat with his chin tucked and his fingers laced together, letting the heat of the fire rise between them. She considered standing, but her legs felt brittle, like reeds that had soaked too long in water. Her mouth was dry, throat scratched raw from days without real food. She tried to form words, but they caught in her chest. He moved first. Slowly, deliberately, he reached to the side and picked up a dented tin mug. He poured the dark brew from a kettle suspended on a makeshift hook above the flames. Steam rose, carrying the scent of something strong and grounding. Without looking at her, he held the cup out across the fire. No demand, no gesture, just the offering. Evelyn hesitated. Then, inch by inch, she shifted forward. The blanket slipped from her shoulders as she reached, fingers trembling. She took the mug from his hand, careful not to touch his skin. The warmth soaked into her palms instantly, as if her blood remembered what comfort was. She sipped. It was bitter, rough on the tongue, but it was the first real thing she had tasted in days. When she looked up again, he was no longer watching the fire. His eyes, dark and steady, met hers for just a breath, then dropped. Not out of shame or coldness, but something quieter, shyness perhaps, or deep practiced solitude. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but dense with things unspoken. She swallowed. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer, just gave a small nod. The barn creaked in the wind. Somewhere above, doves cooed in the rafters. Outside, the fields sparkled under last night's rain, the earth slick and glistening, as if newly born. Evelyn looked around.
The place wasn't just a barn. It had been lived in. A small shelf nailed to the wall held a Bible with a torn cover, a tin of nails, and a row of hand-carved animal figures, clumsy but careful. A pile of chopped wood stacked neatly in one corner. A water barrel with a ladle hung beside it. A table, uneven and stained, stood near the back with tools laid out in deliberate order. This was not a place of chaos. It was a place of solitude, yes, but also of intention. Her eyes returned to him. He hadn't moved, still seated, still silent, but his presence was not threatening, just vast. Like a mountain, easy to fear until you realized it simply was. It didn't lean toward you or away from you. It just waited.
She wanted to ask his name, but something told her not yet. Instead, she finished the coffee in small, grateful sips, then lowered the cup to the floor. Her fingers, now steadier, returned to the blanket, which she pulled close again. The warmth inside her grew, not just from the fire or the drink, but from the wordless permission he had granted. To rest. To be. No one had offered her that since her husband died. No one had seen her as something worth keeping alive. The sound of wood shifting brought her attention back. He stood now, rising with slow grace, his head brushing the lower beams of the roof. He picked up a lantern from a hook, lit it from the fire, and walked to the rear door of the barn. She watched him go. Outside, the morning light caught his frame as he stepped into the mud. He didn't pause or look back, just moved toward the corral where 2 horses waited beneath the half-roof. He began his work, feeding, checking hooves, untying knots in the gate. And still not a single word had passed between them beyond hers. But Evelyn had felt more safety in that barn than any bed she'd lain in since the fever took her husband. She didn't know how long she would be allowed to stay, but for now she would not run. The second morning came without thunder. The rain had passed, leaving behind a sky stretched in soft gray and a chill that clung to the floorboards. Evelyn woke with straw in her hair and stiffness in her limbs, but her eyes opened with less hesitation. She didn't flinch at the sounds around her. The barn groaned as it always did, a living, breathing thing of wood and wind. Somewhere in the rafters, pigeons shifted. Outside, hooves thudded softly against wet soil. She sat up, tugging the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and looked toward the stove. He wasn't there, but the fire had already been relit. And next to it, on the crooked table, a slice of cornbread rested on a tin plate, still warm. She stared at it for a long time, not because she didn't want it, but because no one had left her food in months, not since her husband's cousin dropped off a basket after the funeral and never returned. Not since the banker said, "We're sorry, ma'am," and handed her a notice with the ink still wet. Not since she'd learned how invisible a woman became when no man's name followed hers. She ate it slowly. He returned mid-morning with a bale of hay on one shoulder, soaked to the bone from working the field. His hat dripped, and his boots squelched with each step. She watched him from the cot, unsure whether to speak, whether to move. But he simply passed her, placed the hay where it needed to go, and gave her a brief glance, the kind that held no judgment, no suspicion, just quiet confirmation. You are still here. That is all right. The day passed like that. He worked, she watched. He mended a broken fence post, sharpened a blade, refilled the feed troughs. She learned just by observing that he cared for 2 horses, 3 goats, and a cow that limped slightly on the back leg. He moved with the precision of someone who had done this for years, not rushed, not slow, just deliberate, and never with complaint. She offered to help by standing. Just that. She rose from the cot and stepped toward him while he poured oats into a wooden trough. He looked at her, really looked, his brow creased not with concern, but calculation. Then he pointed to a broom leaning against the far wall. A silent agreement. She swept while he hammered. Her back ached quickly. She hadn't worked in days, not truly, but she welcomed the ache. It meant she was still here, still needed. By noon, the barn looked a little cleaner, not perfect, but better, more lived in, more theirs. He brought her another piece of bread with beans near sunset. She took it without hesitation this time and nodded her thanks. He nodded back. It was the beginning of something. That evening, after he fed the animals and stowed the tools, he lit the lantern and sat by the fire again. She sat too, a little closer this time. The cot remained behind her, but she didn't retreat to it.
Instead, she wrapped her arms around her knees and let her gaze flicker between the flames and the lines of his face. He had a strong jaw, half hidden by a dark beard that looked like it had been trimmed by guesswork. His hands were enormous, the kind that could crush a door hinge without effort, but they moved with care, always with care. He never made noise unless necessary. Even the way he sipped from his cup was quiet. After a long pause, she asked, "Do you live alone out here?" It was a risk, breaking the silence. He didn't answer for several seconds. Then he gave the slightest of nods. "I see." Another pause. Then, softer, "Thank you for not sending me away." He said nothing, but his eyes met hers again and held. It wasn't approval she saw there. It was recognition of someone else who'd lost too much to be afraid of strangers anymore. The fire popped. She looked down at her hands, clasped in her lap. The skin was dry, cracked. Her wedding ring was gone, sold weeks ago to a merchant who hadn't looked her in the eye. The silence grew thicker, but not empty. More like a blanket, awkward at first, but gradually warmer the longer it stayed wrapped around you. When she finally rose to return to the cot, he stood as well. Not to block her path, just instinct, a silent farewell for the night. She gave him a faint smile before turning. She didn't see the way his gaze lingered as she walked away, nor the way his shoulders eased once she lay down. That night, Evelyn didn't dream of her husband, or the house that had once been hers. She didn't dream of death or empty roads or bank doors closing. She dreamed of coffee, of warmth, of hands that didn't touch, but stayed close enough to let her breathe.
The days began to fall into rhythm, quiet as dust settling after a storm. Evelyn no longer woke with a jolt, expecting to be cast out, nor did she eat with hesitation, measuring every bite. The barn, once a place of hiding, was slowly becoming something else, a shell she could stretch her soul into. She cleaned without being asked, chopped vegetables over the warped table, using his rusted knife, her sleeves rolled to the elbows like she belonged. He never corrected her, never interfered. Each morning he left before the sun had fully risen, returning with tools slung over his back or a new bruise blooming along one forearm, the kind that came from lifting more than a man should. Sometimes she found bandages folded neatly beside the stove when he returned, and though he never asked for help, he didn't resist when she took his arm in both hands and wrapped the linen with care. He didn't flinch at her touch. That, in itself, felt like a kind of trust. Once she made stew, not good stew, but warm and honest, the kind that made the air in the barn feel thick with memory. He had taken one bite, then two, and though he said nothing, she noticed the way he cleaned the bowl, scraping the edges with his spoon like it had mattered. That night, for the first time, she laughed. Just once, a low, surprised sound that escaped when she spilled flour on her skirt while baking bread. He'd turned his head at the noise, and for a flicker of a moment, something like a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. That was all, but it was enough to make her chest ache in a strange, unfamiliar way. The ache stayed with her the next morning, when she stepped outside early, barefoot in dew-soaked grass, the sun still hiding behind the hill. The field looked endless, painted with green and soft gold. And in that moment she realized how long it had been since she'd looked at the land and not seen only survival. There was peace here, and it was not fragile. She'd lived in places where kindness broke under pressure, where good men folded beneath debt and sickness, where promises lasted only until the ink dried. But here, in the silent company of a man who spoke less than the wind, she'd found something steadier than words. She didn't know what to call it, but she wasn't ready to leave it. That thought held her through the afternoon, even as clouds began to creep over the hills again. Not storm clouds, just heavy ones, dragging shadows across the ridge. She was sweeping the porch when she saw the rider, a single figure on horseback, trailing dust behind him.
Too neat to be a drifter, too slow to be a messenger. Her stomach tightened before her mind caught up. As he approached, she stepped back inside, heart clickening. The cowboy noticed too. He was inside sharpening a blade, but at the sound of hooves he moved to the door without pause, resting one massive hand against the frame as the rider came into view. Evelyn watched from the shadows. The man on the horse was in his 30s, with a vest that looked like it had seen 100 card tables, and a mustache that twitched with every word. He tipped his hat lazily, but his eyes were sharp. "Looking for a woman," he said, and though the cowboy didn't answer, Evelyn felt her knees threaten to buckle. She knew that voice. His name was Saul. He'd been her husband's cousin, the same man who'd offered to take her off everyone's hands after the funeral, who'd come to her door with pity in his eyes and greed behind his teeth. The same man who knew she had no place to go and saw that as opportunity. She'd run the morning after he cornered her in the kitchen, left behind every possession, every letter, even her name. And now he was here. Her past, her failure, her fear riding a gray horse and calling it justice. Saul leaned forward on the saddle. "She's got dark hair, thin, pretty mouth if she's not frowning. Last seen near Dawson Creek, but someone said a woman was hiding out up this way." The cowboy said nothing. Saul frowned. "You deaf or just slow?" The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was coiled. Evelyn's heart pounded against her ribs as she waited, unsure what would happen, unsure whether the giant who'd never asked her a single question would hand her over now without hesitation. The cowboy stepped forward, just one pace, and rested both hands on the railing. Slowly, he shook his head. Saul narrowed his eyes. "No woman here?" Another shake. The cowboy's face remained unreadable. No anger, no threat, just stillness. Saul cursed under his breath and turned his horse. "If you see her," he muttered, "tell her she owes me a hell of a lot more than silence." Then he kicked the horse and rode off, dust curling up behind him like smoke. Only when the rider disappeared over the hill did Evelyn let her breath go. Her legs gave, and she sank against the barn wall. The cowboy turned to her, not in question, not in blame, but in quiet acknowledgement. She met his eyes. Her past had come knocking. He hadn't opened the door. Something broke inside her then, not in pain, but in relief. For the first time, she believed she might not have to keep running.
That night, she didn't sleep. Not deeply. Her body lay curled beneath the quilt he'd silently draped over her, but her mind wandered. Every creak of the wind outside sounded like hoofbeats. Every shifting plank became a knock. She kept waiting for the door to burst open and for Saul to be standing there with that awful smirk and a voice that could turn honey into poison. But morning came and the barn was quiet. No dust, no horse, no past. Just the familiar scent of hay and iron and smoke from last night's fire. She rose with the first pink streak of dawn, her muscles stiff but grateful for movement. She swept the floor before he returned from the pasture, started a small fire and boiled water in the dented kettle. When he stepped through the door, boots damp with dew, shirt clinging to his back, she was waiting. She didn't say anything, just handed him the coffee, and for a long moment he didn't take it. He looked at her like he was trying to memorize her face in the quiet. Then he nodded, took the cup, and sat down without a word. That was the morning things shifted again. Not dramatically, not with some declaration or touch, but in the smallest ways. He repaired a loose hinge on the barn door and made a second cot out of spare boards. When she offered to help, he let her. They worked side by side that afternoon, passing nails and wood like old friends. She could feel the distance between them shortening, not vanished, but no longer a chasm. That evening, as twilight painted the ridge in soft blues, he brought her a pair of old boots. They were worn at the heel, clearly his at some point, but clean, tied with twine. She looked at them, then at him. He only gestured to her bare feet and stepped back into the shadows. The boots fit, barely. Her toes curled inside them with a kind of disbelief. It had been weeks since her soles had felt anything but dirt and splinters. The next morning, he showed her the fields, not the ones near the barn, the others, hidden by the hill, where grass stretched wild and tall. They walked together without speaking, and she realized then that this was more than a tour. It was an invitation. He was showing her the corners of his world, the forgotten patches of land he'd worked with no one to share it with, the trail he'd carved between two oaks where a small stream trickled over stone, the orchard that bore only sour fruit but that he watered anyway. She asked softly how long he'd lived here. He didn't answer with years. He just said, "Long enough." And she understood. Long enough to know silence.
Long enough to forget what softness sounded like. That afternoon, he led her past the barn to a small cabin she hadn't noticed before, tucked against the edge of the woods, hidden behind a rise of thorn bushes and an old split-rail fence. The cabin was modest. One room, a stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a bed covered in a blanket the color of river mud. He opened the door, stepped aside, and waited. She crossed the threshold like someone stepping into water, slow, cautious, uncertain whether she'd be welcomed. He followed but didn't crowd her, just watched her take it in. She walked to the window. The curtain was torn, but the light poured in through it anyway. She touched the frame. It was real, solid, not a dream. When she turned, he was standing at the door, hand still on the knob. He didn't say, "This is yours." He didn't need to. She saw it in the way he left her alone in the space, how he let her breathe there without hovering, how he gave her a key, just one, rusty and warm from his pocket, and nodded. That night, she didn't sleep in the barn. She slept in the cabin, her boots tucked neatly by the door, her satchel beside the bed. The fire crackled, and for the first time since her husband's fevered last breath, Evelyn cried, not from grief, but from something stranger, relief, the kind that comes when you realize no one is coming to take it all away again, the kind that comes when someone, without ever asking who you were, gives you a place to be who you are now. She didn't know what this was between them, friendship, sanctuary, a beginning? She didn't dare name it, but when she stepped out onto the porch the next morning and saw him in the field, sleeves rolled, shoulders bowed to the sun, she knew she'd stop running. If he asked her to stay, she would. If he didn't, she might stay anyway. It happened 3 weeks later, just as spring finally peeled the frost from the hills and the fields turned green with stubborn, slow beauty. Evelyn had taken to rising early, tending to the goats before the sun fully touched the grass, her boots now worn at the toes from use. The cabin had become more than shelter. It had become a rhythm. She opened windows to let in light. She cooked. She swept. She laughed sometimes, mostly to herself. And each evening, when the work was done, she and the cowboy would sit on the porch, facing the fields in silence. He'd hand her a cup of coffee, and they'd watch the wind stir the high grass like a tide. No confessions, no demands, just the kind of quiet that made a person feel like they belonged. But peace, as she'd learned, always draws out those who feed on its absence. The horse came fast over the ridge, kicking up dust, and she knew before he even dismounted. Saul. His hat was new, his boots polished, and in his hand he held a folded paper. Always a bad sign. He called her name like it still belonged to him. When she didn't answer, he stepped toward the cabin, toward the life she'd built like it was something he could repossess. The cowboy was already in the yard, between them. He didn't shout, he didn't reach for a weapon, he simply stood. Saul sneered, said something about law, about marriage rights, about debts unpaid. He waved the paper like it meant anything out here, far from courtrooms and clerks. She stepped forward, lips parted to speak, but the cowboy lifted a hand, slow, steady, not to silence her, but to say, "You don't need to. I've got this." Then he walked toward Saul, each step heavy.
Deliberate, no violence, just weight, presence. Saul's smirk faltered. He stepped back, then stopped, tried to hold ground, but the cowboy didn't stop until they stood face to face. The paper crumpled in Saul's fingers. The cowboy didn't raise a fist, didn't growl a threat. He just reached out and took the paper from the man's hand, tore it clean in half, then again, then let the pieces fall between them like ash. Saul backed up, voice rising, anger, disbelief, but his feet were already turning. He climbed onto the horse with jerky movements, cursing over his shoulder, but no one chased him. The dust swallowed him on his way back down the hill. Evelyn stood frozen at the edge of the porch, heart in her throat. The cowboy turned, met her eyes. Still no words. But in that look, she saw it all. I will not let anyone take you. Not again. Not while I'm standing. She walked to him, slowly, as if afraid the world might shift again. When she reached him, she placed her palm against his chest. He didn't flinch, just lowered his head, closed his eyes for the briefest moment. She rested her forehead against him, her breath catching. That night, they didn't sit on the porch. They sat inside, closer than usual. The fire crackled. She baked bread. He carved something, another animal figure, this one rougher, shaped like a goat. When he placed it beside the others on the shelf, she smiled, not just with her mouth, with her whole face. Spring came fully after that. The orchard bloomed in stubborn pink. The barn smelled of clean hay and warm earth. Travelers passed now and then, but none stayed, and she didn't leave. She never asked what would happen if she did. She no longer needed to. Because here, in a cabin built by calloused hands and guarded by silence, she had found something no one could steal, a home. Not because he gave it to her, but because he never asked her to earn it. He simply made room and never once closed the door.